My name is Robbie Davis once again, and I'm speaking from the AP Language and Comp perspective. And remember, the key words earlier were conversation, connection, and context. We'll add another one this time, a scary one, complexity. Complexity, okay? Now, our course is a writing and reading course focused on the concepts of rhetoric and argument. And the objectives of the course, of course, to mold our students into deliberative citizens who can both contribute arguments, but also analyze and evaluate the arguments that they encounter. And the arguments they encounter are both textual and visual, right? The skills required to do visual analysis are the same as the skills required for textual analysis, we find out. And so with that three-step process in mind that we've been talking about, observations and making the connections, then drawing the inferences, that three-step process that we use to analyze an artwork, well, that's the three-step process for analyzing any rhetoric, right? Anything rhetorical as well. Now, maybe one of the most difficult things, tell me if you agree, to get our AP students to do is to embrace the complexity of an issue. Now, maybe that's because they take such pride in, a lot of them are the smart kids. And maybe by admitting that, they don't have a firm answer, yes or no. Maybe that's admitting a weakness, I'm not sure. Perhaps it's a cultural thing, that the idea, of flitting between right and wrong, left and right, black and white, somewhere on the spectrum, perhaps that is a sign of a weakness. I don't know. But our students are often unwilling to wrestle with the complexities of an issue, to only wind up more perplexed when they're done, right? Would you agree that they are? And that is a real difficult thing. It is an imperative, of course, in our course to teach our students that argument is not a contest. It's not a debate. The goal is not to have a winner, but it is to wrestle with the complexities of an issue and to find solutions, to find answers, to find understandings. That's what we mean by argument. All right, with that in mind, we're going to go to a piece of art that we encountered this morning. Okay? And we're going, this could turn into a big-time wrestling match here, right? As we wrestle with the complexities of Eastman Johnson's Negro Life at the South. All right, are you ready? So let's take a look at it. Now, we did our observations. We collected all of the details, so we don't have to go over that. But we did notice that there were positive elements. I guess that's an elementary way of saying it. There were negative elements, right? And what we're left with is a lot of contradiction, a lot of ambiguity, in fact. But what we at least walk away with is, wow, this is complex, isn't it? There's a lot of complexity here. In fact, we're not the only ones to have wrestled with the complexity. Take a look at this. Ed Brown writes in this long passage, he says, these are not real human beings in this painting, but characters used to portray the notion that slavery was not always a bad thing. Now, compare that to Hugh Honor, who writes about the painting. He says, there can surely be no doubt that Johnson intended to restore blacks the human dignity of which they had been deprived by so many less sensitive or less able artists. So that's a 180, isn't it, right? From what we just read. Patricia Hills at Boston University writes, today we're likely to be ambivalent in our feelings about life in the South. Notice that. And concludes, indeed, the content of the painting is ambiguous, giving no indication of the interpretation Johnson intended it to have. What about that? As we look at people wrestling with the same thing that we're wrestling with. Now, what about this? Despite what the artist may have intended, slave owners and abolitionists interpreted the painting differently. Those opposing slavery as an atrocity to humanity saw it as a symbol of our morally bankrupt and decaying system. Slave owners took a more nostalgic view, pointing out the looks of contentment on the black figures' faces. This painting might serve as a great way to introduce the question, what is the story we tell ourselves about the story? As we look at the painting, we must wonder how much of our interpretations are cast by the context and constructs of our lives, right? The biases with which we approach an artwork. Well, we experienced that this morning, didn't we? I mean, we had those reactions, which when I think about this, and I'll share this with you just as an aside, when I think about this last idea, I'm reminded of this photo that appeared on a 2009 Form B synthesis question. Do you recall it? It was a question about should schools support individuality or conformity? And the reason I think about this is because I'll never forget how shocked I was at how some of my students responded to this photo. You didn't know that this was Nazi oppression, did you? I mean, my students saw this photo, and to them this was horror, unimaginable horror, the oppression here. All these kids being made to do the same thing, you know, that reaction, you know, they approach that with attitudes and biases that, well, certainly that I did not, you know, and I don't think, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Well, all right, with that in mind, with all that in mind, I want to admit something to you that at my first viewing of the painting, I, like many of you, I was struck by what seemed to be this sugar-coated version of slave life here that seems apparent. I found it both comical and offensive at the same time. I noted the date was 1870, and that sort of reassured me that what we were looking at here was, you know, one of these twisted sort of 12 Oaks ideas of, you know, the good old nostalgia, you know, the good old days on the plantation, you know, that sort of thing. But then I noticed something intriguing to an English teacher, to me, something awfully intriguing here. And that was the title of the painting. The title of the painting is Negro Life, say it, at the South. You even saw that earlier that she wrote in. Now, are we talking about a prepositional error? Or are we talking about a colloquialism, perhaps? A colloquial use of at? What are we talking about here? Or something else? Well, of course, that led me, I had to find out some context, right? I had to find out some information. Well, about 10 minutes is all it took of, you know, doing a little internet investigation. And then I was more confused because all the sources kept saying 1859. Well, it was then I discovered what we were told this morning, that it's a copy that we have here at the High, 1870, he redid it. But the original was in 1859. So the painting was a pre-war statement. But what about that title? I found out that it got even more confusing than that because the title it's sometimes given as Negro Life in the South. And I found out that it's sometimes called Life in the South. It's sometimes called My Old Kentucky Home, and it's even called Our Old Virginia Home. Why? Well, why My Old Kentucky Home? Are you ready? Well, let's compare it. Let's let them have a conversation here. Let's let the painting converse a little bit with the lyrics to My Old Kentucky Home. Read them there and tell me, what's the connection? Why would somebody, did you know that they actually used this painting as the cover art for the sheet music to Stephen Foster's My Old Kentucky Home? Why? Do you see the line in there, perhaps? What is it? We don't want to say it out loud, do we? We don't want to say it out loud, right? The sun shines bright in the old Kentucky home. 'Tis summer. The darkies are gay. And it goes on from there. Yeah, is that... We get that, don't we? It was actually used as cover art, too, for My Old Virginia, or Carry Me Back to Old Virginia as well. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating? Why is it fascinating? Because this is one big contextual problem. Because guess what? This is not Kentucky. In fact, it's not even rural. It's not a plantation that we're looking at. The setting for this painting is Washington, D.C. What we're looking at is a scene, an urban scene, a scene in a courtyard, a backyard area, a walled-off area behind a home, and we actually know what home it is, a home on F Street in Washington, D.C. Now, you ready for this? I had fun, guys, doing this. This is fun. This particular section of Washington, off F Street there, happened to be the place where Southern legislators kind of grouped themselves together, their homes while they were there working. Got it? Yeah. In other words, it was a neighborhood full of Southerners. So maybe I found my answer to that preposition, right? Maybe this perhaps is a place that Johnson and others referred to as the South, at the South. Negro life at the South. Maybe. All right, let me talk to you a little bit about this. There's some contextual things to keep in mind about this setting. The presence of slaves in the nation's capital was one of the most contentious and hotly debated issues of the years before the Civil War. It was talked about on the floors of Congress a lot, and sometimes it got kind of violent. Southerners in this particular area would often, get ready, keep their slaves that they brought to town to be their servants in these walled-off areas to hide them, basically, you know, because of the sensibilities of the people of Washington and for other reasons. The streets of Washington were patrolled by a special police force, a slave police force that would challenge blacks that they met on the streets. Why? Because there are two kinds of blacks in Washington, D.C. at the time. There are slaves doing their master's bidding, and there are free blacks. Isn't that fascinating? And so it was, and Washington was a place where abolitionist activists would sometimes encourage slaves to take off for freedom, and also it's a place where unscrupulous slave hunters would capture free blacks and spirit them off to slavery. Remember 12 Years a Slave? He's captured in Washington, D.C. And where's he sent to? Louisiana, I believe is where he's sent off to. Isn't that fascinating? This is the coolest thing, isn't it? It's just so cool. Now, let's keep in mind these ideas of conversation, connection, and context, and we'll focus on two specific aspects of the painting here and do a little analysis. Tell me something, first of all. Do you hear anything? We talk about what we see in the painting a lot, but let me ask you, what do you hear? Are there any sounds? And if so, what's the predominant sound?
Banjo.
What's that? The band, the music, right? There's music, right? Of course, the banjo player. A black man playing the banjo is a problematic figure historically, isn't it? Yeah, it is, because I mean, we associate it with artistry and joy and that sort of thing, but we also associate it with some pretty denigrating stereotypes too, don't we? The minstrel image and that sort of thing. And as I said, it's complex. Well, what is Johnson's point? Well, compare it to this. Here's another painting Johnson did in the very same year, 1859. Ready? Okay, you see. All he did was, it's another painting. He repainted this detail and turned it into its own work of art. But you ready? Here's the answer. What did he title it? He called it Confidence and Admiration. Boy, that just changes everything, doesn't it? We get it. We get that what's taking place here. It's older generation instructing younger generation, isn't it? And it even connects to this scene here of the woman working with the child, teaching the child. So it explains something for us. I just find that fascinating. What about another figure? Are you ready? No, let's do one other thing, maybe for the lit teachers in the room too, or Lang teachers. But how about this? Take that image there and let's put it alongside Langston Hughes' Dream Boogie. And tell me, do these two things have anything to say to each other? I'll read it for you. Now, you know Hughes, it's the music of jazz, isn't it? That runs through his poetry. So think about this a moment. Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie-woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Listen closely. You hear their feet beating out and beating out. You think it's a happy beat? Listen to it closely. Ain't you heard something underneath like a... What did I say? Sure. I'm happy. Take it away. Hey, pop, bop, mop. What do they say to each other about the role of music in the black community and black culture, and the role that music played? Frederick Douglass once said, slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that fascinating when you put those two things side by side and explore the conversation they have with each other? One more figure let's take a look at, and that would be the white woman entering. We talked about her, right? A white figure entering this hole in the wall. Here it is blown up for you. Okay? It might be a little hard to see, but here's another famous painting of something similar. It's called A Visit from the Old Mistress by Winslow Homer. Are there some differences in this scene where we have this white figure coming into this realm of of blackness, so to speak, here? Is there a difference? Is there a difference between the way that the black figures in this painting here are reacting to her? Look, this is scary. Why is she here, for God's sake, right? Look at these. They're nervous. You know, she's come into the cabin and they're nervous. What is she here to? You see the apprehensiveness of it all. And here, as we noted this morning, nobody's even paying attention to this woman when she comes through, except for the one girl who could, I don't know, some people speculate she might be even mocking her as he's painted her in sort of this mirror image, you know. What are you doing here? Intruding upon this world. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating when you look at the comparison? Take a look at some of these quotations and how might they converse and connect. Look here, Edward Snowden. I grew up with the understanding that the world I lived in was one where people enjoyed a sort of freedom to communicate with each other in privacy. And what about this one? Poverty is relative, and the lack of food and of the necessities of life is not necessarily a hardship. Spiritual and social ostracism, the invasion of your privacy, are what constitute the pain of poverty. And Johnny Depp says you use your money to buy privacy. Is there something in the painting, in Eastman Johnson's painting, about privacy being invaded? This private world that belonged to these people being invaded by this figure? Possibly. It's kind of a neat exercise, isn't it, to put those quotations up there and compare them. Now, most student writers, I think you all know, AP Lang teachers certainly do, know that they make no attempt at all to use the voice of the image in that collection of sources on the synthesis question. I would offer you this, that perhaps if we use visual sources as the starting point for conversations about issues, right? Arguments, things we're going to analyze, and issues for the synthesis question, that we can encourage and facilitate and even enhance our students' engagement with both visual and textual arguments if images are the place that we begin. I don't know. I think that there's that possibility. Any questions or comments about the painting or anything? Yay. Good.